Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome to the 52nd episode of the Odd Vlog, and in this episode we're looking back at Star Wars in 2022 and reviewing everything that came out. And we're going to start straight away with the Book of Boba Fett. I have to say I was really excited for the Book of Boba Fett, especially after what we'd seen the character do in The Mandalorian Season 2. I felt like this was going to be a great show, and finally getting to see some real in-depth Boba Fett action, something that we've never really seen before, not properly. But overall, I have to say I was incredibly disappointed with the series. I found it unbelievably underwhelming. It starts off really well. I loved the way that they actually showed how he escaped from the Sarlacc pit. I thought that was really good. And then he goes on to kind of tell a new story of how he ends up with raiders living in the desert, learns their ways, and kind of helps them out. And there's some action sequences in there, and it's kind of good, but really not what I expected his sort of second origin story to be. So it was kind of a bit of a weird twist, and then that follows on to what kind of happens to him in the present time, when he's trying to kind of take control almost of Tatooine and take over from where Jabba the Hutt had kind of just left everything in disarray, and he tries to pick up the pieces and effectively become like a mob boss for Tatooine. So kind of an interesting concept, but I just felt like the portrayal of the character was incredibly underwhelming. He's supposed to be, from what we gather, this incredibly like badass character, and he kind of just comes across as a bit of a pussycat. He doesn't do really anything. It's also very predictable in the final episode when you see him like riding the Rancor into the final battle. That was kind of cool, but you knew it was going to happen. It was just inevitable that was going to take place, purely from the conversations he'd had beforehand and how it led to that. So there was just some really predictable moments in it. The action sequences I felt were a little bit, just disappointing, and I felt like some of the actual plot and the story was really weird. I mean, having like this high-tech teenage Power Ranger style group hanging around in Tatooine just seemed really out of place. Their colourful like moped scooter things just made them look really cheesy. I'm not saying it's not necessarily like not Star Wars. Anything can be Star Wars. It's just the fact that it was so out of place. Like, you could see those things happening on somewhere like Coruscant, where it's more high tech and it would just fit really well. On Tatooine, it's a desert back planet. There's nothing there. Everyone is effectively living in control of a mob. No one's got any money. It's incredibly run down, beaten up. That's the whole idea. That's where Luke comes from. It's where Anakin comes from. And yet we've got this weird high tech gadget shop where all of these teens go and modify themselves and become like part cyborgs. They're so out of place. It looks really bad, and they kind of just come across as being like a Star Wars Power Ranger group. It just doesn't look right. The best thing about Boba Fett really was when The Mandalorian turned up. So in some ways its best episodes were the ones where Mando was actually in it, and the rest of it I could have just thrown away and didn't really enjoy. So an incredibly disappointing start to the year, I thought, with Boba Fett, and it certainly did have its problems, I think, in terms of writing and setting, and the characters that were in there just incredibly uninteresting. And weirdly, in a lot of the reviews that I've seen of 2022 for what came out in Star Wars, most people are just sort of comparing the Obi-Wan Kenobi show against the Andor show, and almost completely forget that Boba Fett even came out. And initially, when I was thinking about what I was going to be doing in this episode, even I completely forgot. It was just such a forgettable series. If anything, it was more like a kind of stopgap between Mando Season 2 and Season 3, and just like a bit of a filler in between. That's how it felt. Very bizarre. So yeah, incredibly disappointed with the Book of Boba Fett. They may do more and it may get better. Who knows? I'm not sure whether or not I even want that at this point. And then we get on to the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, and I think that this was probably so hyped up that it was always going to end up being disappointing. And I don't think it was that disappointing. I think it actually was really good. I think what it suffered from was the fact that it was done as a series, because you had I felt a great start to the series and a great ending to the series, but everything in the middle was kind of just a little bit stupid. And again, some of the decisions in the writing was just dreadful, like trying to sneak out child Princess Leia from an enemy base by hiding her under your coat, where you can clearly still see that she's there, is just an example of some really bad imagination and script writing and storytelling, because it looks awful on camera, and it's just pathetic. And then again, when Obi-Wan tries to cross like a barrier gate, like a laser gate, surely Obi-Wan Kenobi, of all people, can figure out that all you need to do is walk around the gate rather than trying to fight your way through it. But for some reason, he's not clever enough to think like that, and they just, I don't know, they just kind of make up this story for the middle of the season that just doesn't need to be there. I kind of felt like you could take out the middle couple of episodes, chuck them in the bin, and you'd still end up with a nice, more concise, probably more of a movie feel, and it would have been a lot better. There were some good things, though, about this series, and I did do a full kind of breakdown of pretty much most of the episodes separately, so please do go back and have a look at all of those. Overall, I felt like it was quite good. I just felt like you could have cut out the middle of it, because there were some really dodgy mid episodes of that season. So maybe they'll do more, possibly, I don't know. They do kind of set it up for it, with Qui-Gon Jinn coming back at the end, or his Force Ghost rather. So I don't know, they might do more, and I kind of hope that they do. I would like to perhaps see that character, or Kenobi particularly, going off and having his own adventures, but I don't think we need to see him fighting against Darth Vader anymore. That's been done, and really we need to kind of stop doing that, because if we keep on doing that, then everything that happens in A New Hope kind of just loses some of its gravity, I felt. So that was an okay series. It was all right. It could have been better in places. Anyway, moving on. After that, we then come to what I mentioned before, which was the Andor series, and I felt that Andor was absolutely fantastic. I thought it was really gritty and edgy, and it had a kind of darkness to it almost, but it just felt grimy and in a good way. It was just so well delivered. We know obviously what happens in the events of Rogue One, so to kind of look back on those characters and give them a bit more depth, and building other characters around them, it just felt really good. And you had so much going on throughout what was quite a long series, actually, in different obviously parts of that story, where, you know, he's clearly kind of being guided into this almost underworld of rebels, and them coming up with these plots and plans to, you know, blow up bases and steal their money and all these things. It just felt like a spy novel, you know. It just felt like it just had that level of grit that things like the Obi-Wan Kenobi show didn't have, and certainly the Book of Boba Fett never had anything like that. So that little edginess and that darkness to it, I felt was really, really good. From what I understand, a lot of people don't like the fact that it's quite a slow series, but the same people will then complain about the fact that other shows don't have enough character development. So you need the slowness, you need to slow the pace down and give characters an opportunity to show themselves and to develop and to grow with the audience. And that's where I felt like the Andor series just did it superbly well. And there are some truly heartbreaking moments as well in that series and in that story, with what happens and goes on in the prison, where they're kind of making parts of the Death Star, even though you don't know it at the time. A fantastic tie-in that, you know, Andor is actually building the thing that kills him, and it's, you know, there's that kind of dark tone to it that just sells this series for me as being absolute peak, and definitely the best thing that came out in 2022. I really, really enjoyed it. I'd kind of like them to do maybe another series, but perhaps sort of telling some of the other stories, not necessarily Andor himself, because we know what he does. He ends up joining the rebellion, becomes their spy. I'm sure there's other stories that you could tell for him as he goes and has those adventures. But there's also other characters now that we've seen that he's kind of working with, and they're also part of the rebellion, that would be great to see. There's also some fantastic Easter eggs in that series. When we see in like the antique collector store, you've got all kinds of things going on in there. You've got Starkiller's helmet, you've got Padme's headdress, all kinds of weird and wonderful things. There's holocrons on the shelves. You know, I love those little things. They are there really for like content for content's sake, but it is fun to kind of spot those things, and it's a very Marvel approach to kind of storytelling, to just put these things in the background and for the audience to try and spot what they can. You never know what you're going to find. And I loved that. It made each episode really interesting and quite compelling. So yeah, for me, that was the best thing of the year. On a side note, Tales of the Jedi was an animated series that came out in 2022, and I'll be completely honest, I haven't seen all of it. Part of the problem with that is that I find I'm just not interested in it. I really don't care. It seems to focus mostly on telling backstories for people like Count Dooku. Well, we know what happens with Count Dooku, and if you read any of the novels, of which there's tons behind me, we've already had that character development. Master and Apprentice by Claudia Gray, for an example, tells some of his backstory and makes his character that more interesting. But I just didn't feel that with this show, and in the end I think I've got like 2 episodes of it left to watch. So, you know, okay, I haven't seen the whole thing, but also like stories with Ahsoka in it, for example. We see Ahsoka from like a really young child coming into her own throughout the whole of the Clone Wars series. I don't need any more backstory to the backstory. It's just stories that have been done before, and I think even in her novel, a lot of the stories are the same as well. So it kind of just felt like a little bit pointless. It just hasn't drawn me in as a series, unfortunately. I'm not so bothered that it's animated. That doesn't bother me in the slightest, because I like things like The Bad Batch, Clone Wars I loved, and obviously Rebels as well. So, you know, the fact that it's animated doesn't really lose anything for me. It's simply just the fact that I'm just not drawn in by these stories. And part of the problem, and this is going off on a bit of a tangent really, and one of the things I really struggle, I think, with Star Wars at the moment, I don't like the way that they're telling their stories. So if you compare it to what Marvel Studios do, Marvel Studios have a really linear story timeline. So basically you follow it from beginning to end, and it just keeps on going and going and going and going, telling new stories and just progressing those character developments all the way through, and it will just keep on almost refreshing itself all the time. With Lucasfilm and Star Wars, they are obsessed with kind of building constantly within the same time parameters. So you've got episode 1 and you've got episode 9, and they're just constantly filling up more stories of everything that happens between those 2 events. And I'm just sort of thinking, okay, that's fine, it's a big galaxy, there's lots of stories to tell, but what happens either side of that timeline? And that's why I think they need to be doing actually some more live action stuff for the High Republic. I mean, this is a fantastic resource of storytelling. You could do the Knights of the Old Republic, same thing as again there. And I know that we are getting a show that is set back a little bit more with the Acolyte show, but I just feel that there should be more of that. Everything that they've seemed to have done, particularly this year with Boba Fett, Kenobi, Andor, Tales of the Jedi, it's all set in this timeline when we know what happens to these characters, and because of that I feel like something is lost a little bit. Why do we care about what happens to, say, Andor, when we know that in the movie he's going to end up dead? I don't want to have to know already where these characters are going. I want to be able to watch them not knowing anything. And that's why the sequel trilogy, I thought, had a lot of potential. It did have its problems. I'm not saying it's great. But what I'm saying is, where the way that it ended at episode 9, there are stories that you carry on from that. You could start telling stories about what happens now with Finn, now that he's discovered that actually he does have these Force abilities. Well, tell his story. Why can't he go off and now be a Jedi and have his own adventures? That's a fantastic story to tell, and it's new and it's refreshing, and we don't know what will happen, and that, I think, is the key. Similarly with Rey, does she now go off and do her own Jedi Academy and train other Force users? That could lead into a whole myriad of storylines with the rise again of perhaps the Sith, Jedi, you could have Grey Jedi, you could do anything from that, because it would be completely new, and it's telling that story, it's continuing that timeline to something that is completely and utterly fresh that we've never seen before. It's still Star Wars, but I think that is what for me would be way more interesting. Even with the High Republic to an extent, you know obviously where eventually the timeline ends up, but it's so far set in the past that the stories are completely new, fresh characters other than Yoda, but you know, I can live with that. It's fantastic to get some new, fresh Star Wars stories, and I think we should stop trying to live within this period of time where we seem to be stuck and focus on what happens on either side of that. So that's just my take on Star Wars at the moment, and because of that I think 2022 overall was really disappointing. Other than the Andor series, which I really enjoyed, everything else just felt really bland and not particularly interesting. And even when you get series like Kenobi, where you had some really epic moments, you also had a lot of really stupid ones, and because of that I don't think it really lives up to the expectation that it had. As excited as everyone was for it, I felt like they really dropped the ball on it. But there we go, never mind. Star Wars is obviously a really a divisive thing to talk about, and everyone will have their own opinions. So please leave a comment, let me know what you think. Which of those series did you actually enjoy? Which ones didn't you enjoy? I'm sure some people will agree and disagree with my opinions, and by all means, please let me know. Let's have a chat about it. So there we go, that was my take on 2022. Let's get into 2023, and hopefully we'll get even more stuff. We've got Mando Season 3, we've got Bad Batch, we've got Ahsoka. Hopefully it will be a really good year. We're still stuck in this timeline, but hopefully we'll get some decent content and we'll see what happens. So with that said, we're all done. Please give the video a like, please subscribe. This is the 52nd episode of the Odd Vlog, and we will keep on doing them. Every time there's new content and a new show, we can do a review and we can sit down and let all the thoughts out. So with that said, we're all done. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys real soon.